Different people are using the word atheism with different meanings. And one of the reasons why debates within atheism are often so embittered and vitriolic is that they want to insist, no, only my definition is the true and correct meaning of the word, rather than just saying, look, for this discussion to proceed, we just have to say, okay, there's atheism definition 1 and atheism definition 2. We come to some mutual understanding and then move on to more pragmatic considerations like, what do we do next? There are some atheists who look at the type of cultural festival you see on your screen here, and they see something that should be abolished. They look at this and think, well, ideally, 100 years from now or 200 years from now, this type of religious festival and religious ceremony will have disappeared from the world. It will have become a thing of the past. It will be something talked about in history lessons, in the academic study of cultural anthropology, but it will not be something that people believe in. It will not be something that people practice. The songs being sung here to the monotheistic God, the ceremonies worshiping that God, will actually disappear from society. Some atheists think of the future of atheism that way. Some atheists think of the end point or goal that they're working towards as their activism as being the abolition of this type of ceremony. And then there are some atheists, and these people don't have a separate name, they don't have a separate category, they don't self-identify as a separate movement. There are some atheists who vocally and actively say that they would preserve this type of ritual, they would preserve the songs, they would actually preserve all of the cultural trappings, the institutions, the architecture, the festival of Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, of all the religions. They would preserve it all. They're only interested in a sort of inward transformation of the people from being believers to unbelievers, that people will change from having a religious mentality to having a secular mentality.
Is it good to have a cultural celebration? I think it is. It seems that you think it is. Now, if we were starting afresh within our culture, would I say, I tell you what, let's build it upon some archaic religion that nobody believes anymore? Of course I wouldn't say that, would I? But we're not starting afresh. We're starting on a position with a whole lot of history. And when I look back at that Christmas celebration, I see a whole load of depth and richness that has the culture that is so difficult to create from fresh cloth. You talk about these other cultures. I admire people, actually, totally contrary to what you say, I admire people in these other cultures that can take a secular path in a day-to-day life, who can lose their religion and will say, that is what I've done, because, like you say, that's not an easy thing for them to do within the societies in which they live. It's a lot easier for me. It's not so easy for them. But still maintain the cultural trappings, the celebrations, the festivals, and manage to incorporate those.
And then, fairly enough, they also, of course, want to pick and choose about which aspects of the tradition they would preserve. I would say, for example, I'm conceding to the other side here, they would not actually want to preserve circumcision, male circumcision or female circumcision, but these people are broadly open to being conservative in relation to religious cultures. So that's a very deep divide within atheism, and two subtly but profoundly different groups of people who are both using the name of atheism, but in the pursuit of different objectives.
But still maintain the cultural trappings, the celebrations, the festivals, and manage to incorporate those. It's syncretism again, but going in the other direction, incorporating those religious things into a more secular basis and saying, do you know what, we can keep these things, right? Everybody enjoys them, everybody enjoys them, everybody enjoys them, let's keep them.
On one level, this is a really, really shallow difference of opinion. Shallow but important. And then there's a little bit more of a profound political point to be made. And it's a point that applies to both sides. This is not a situation where I'm right and he's wrong. And on the shallow issue I'm about to speak on cultural differences, there's no way one side can be right and the other side can be wrong. How important is opera? Should the government of Canada spend taxpayers' money to maintain arts such as opera and the ballet? Well, if you're willing to accept the incredibly myopic, self-centered view that this guy does and just state as a fact, this culture is wonderful, everyone enjoys it, it's important, it's valuable, then of course it's a very short leap to say, well, then of course taxpayers' money should be spent to preserve the opera, to make it possible for Canadians in downtown Toronto to go and see traditional European culture like Italian opera and French and Russian ballet, let's say. I don't know exactly which traditions of ballet they're preserving. Maybe it's the Czech ballet. I don't know. That argument is really very, very hard to sustain. Even jazz music, it's a very small percentage of Canadians who value jazz. And our government actually spends millions and millions of dollars supporting jazz music and jazz festivals because it's considered some kind of refined high culture. But of course, it gets even more absurd when you start to ask, well, why are taxes being taken from everyone, the rich and the poor alike, to be spent on a type of culture that's really only appreciated by a very small minority of wealthy people? So one of the concepts he uses again and again, Noel Plum, the guy I'm indirectly debating with here, he just refers to my idea of culture as drab. And he completely presumes that his idea of culture is colorful and entertaining and wonderful and is something that everyone enjoys. No, not everyone enjoys the opera. Not everyone enjoys the ballet. Not everyone enjoys jazz music. For many of us, sitting for 3 hours through an opera is a horrible experience. And this is, of course, a secular example. Now, at Cambridge University, England, there's a major annual performance of the Te Deum. There are many major performances throughout the year of, I was going to say carols, of Christian choir music, Christian songs in this traditional Gothic architecture. Now, I'm not in a position to say nobody enjoys that. Some people do. And some of the people who appreciate it are atheists, are secular people who get dressed up and sit in a church for hours of hearing songs about how wonderful Jesus is and how wonderful God is. But it doesn't take a lot of maturity to recognize there are some people who don't appreciate that music, who don't want to sit and listen to that for 3 hours. And there are some people who really dislike it intensely. There are people who dislike their tax dollars paying for this music to be performed. There are people who pay tuition to a specific college within Cambridge, and they don't like the fact that some of their tuition dollars are going to pay for this religious ritual in a religious chapel, religious architecture, maybe many centuries owned. There are questions here of saying, well, wait a minute. It's not merely that not everyone enjoys this. There's a real struggle going on for what the present and future of our culture ought to be. Now, his situation as a kind of monolingual, monocultural guy in England, it is different from the situation of myself as an ethnic Jew in Canada. Do you expect me to celebrate the culture of the British Empire in Canada? A culture that came to us through genocide and conquest. A culture that, for me as an ethnic Jew is always going to be a few steps alien from who my family were and my background and so on. But it's even more alien when you're looking at it in terms of the history of, yes, y'all, slavery and genocide and conquest and colonialism. Now, by the same token, I would imagine the significance of Italian opera in Italy is somewhat different than it is in Canada. There are all kinds of discussions we could have here about government policy, so on and so forth. But this problem is not just as shallow as saying, well, some people like opera and some people don't. It's not just as shallow or simple as saying, well, some people want to go to this chapel in Cambridge University and hear the performance of the Te Deum. They want to hear Christian songs being sung, and some people don't. There's a deeper and broader question here of institutional learning. So this is really the use of the word learning that's used in economics. And of course, it's invaded the social sciences, particularly political science. How do people know in a particular city that if they hang around City Hall and watch for the notices of condemned properties being put up for auction, they can make a lot of money? The practices of the state, the way people respond to authority, the way they can make money out of, the standard operation of bureaucracy and authority, that's a type of learning which is very rarely, or maybe even never, taught in schools and colleges. But people working within the real estate industry, they learn all of these things. They learn where and when to go at City Hall to get these notices and find out what's going on. They know how to look up and find out about zoning changes. That can be worth millions of dollars, that knowledge. There's a whole network of learning that goes on. And of course, it all happens in the shadow of government regulation and government enforcement. That these people who are making money out of real estate, for example, they know that if they break a law, if they break a zoning rule or something, it'll cost them a lot of money or maybe even put them in prison. In the same way, people develop attitudes towards democracy, bureaucracy, authority in the shadow of these institutions. There's a type of profound learning that goes on at Cambridge University, which isn't just what happens in the classroom. It's what happens through precisely these rituals, these performances, and people's participation in them. I think there's a type of learning that goes on if children grow up really being told that the opera and the ballet are the pinnacle of our culture, are to be looked up at as the glory of European civilization, and by some extension the glory of Canadian civilization. To go to a university where it is the Te Deum that's being performed, it's songs to the glory of the Christian God and Jesus, and that is what people dress up in their finest clothes to go and do, that's the celebration that will punctuate a very boring university experience for many of these students. Most of the students I knew at Cambridge, they had very little time and very little money. They scurried back and forth between crummy apartments and the library. They lived very harried lives. And these ritual occasions, they were major events in the lives of those students. And everything about that performance, including the architectural setting, including just the splendor and display of wealth that's involved, if you like. It's a contrast to the shoddiness of their day-to-day lives, living in and out of a shoebox, meeting with professors in offices that look like a shoebox, so on and so forth. There is a type of learning here. There are attitudes towards authority and society and so on and so forth that shape the way people behave, that shape the way they act. I do think that people going to Mecca and Medina, people participating in the stoning of Satan, people participating in sometimes purely symbolic, theatrical rituals, I do think that shapes the culture from top to bottom in a way that's reflected in how do you behave at City Hall, how do you behave at Parliament, how do you speak to authority figures, how do you treat police, and how do the police treat you. So this is something that for me goes deeper and further than just the question of whether or not people enjoy participating in those rituals. But even so, even on that shallower level, I don't think it's asking too much of the other side to recognize some of us, hate what you love in culture. It's the most blatantly obvious thing. Some people hate going to the opera. Some people hate having to sit through several hours of reading of the Torah at a synagogue. They hate it. They don't want to be forced to sit through it, or they don't want to do it. Force might be too strong a word. They don't want to do it just to please their grandmother or please their wife or please some family or what have you. There's this really strange, deep presumption that these festivals are wonderful. And as he says, everyone appreciates them compared to the quote-unquote drab alternative of getting rid of them from your life.
You're telling me that your method's going to work better? I don't think so, because it's just drab and dull.
I'm sorry, I've never spoken to a Muslim atheist, meaning here an ex-Muslim atheist. I've never spoken to even one that said that they miss attending prayers, that they miss attending lectures and listening to the singing. I have never met even one who said that they dearly wish they could participate in the animal sacrifice elements, the sort of slaughter and sharing of meat elements, or going back on the Hajj or what have you. It's a very, very strange claim that I think reflects a really narrow, really self-centered white British perspective. Let me just ask you directly, Noel, if you were born Navajo Indian, do you think you'd perceive this the same way you do?
I was nervous about studying God's Word because of past hurts that I seen a lot of missionaries had done to the Native people.
I realized that God made me this way for a reason. He gave me my family for a reason. It's just something that you're born into. And when it came with Denise, we encountered that a lot. She had a lot of pent-up bad anger towards the Christian church because of some of the stuff that they did to Native Americans in the name of Jesus.
As I looked at her as she was talking about God and reading His Word, that moment I said, you know what, I want that light, I want that fire. I
got closer to God than I could ever imagine. I was going to Bible studies every Wednesday and I was just reading the Bible, and it changed me. I've seen God work some great miracles. God's even spoken to me in my life.
He found Jesus through science. It brought him right back to the creator of our earth.
I don't think it's too exotic or too bizarre to ask that question. What if you were a black indigenous person in Australia? What if you were Cree or Ojibwe or Mohawk? The British Empire invaded these places, destroyed the indigenous culture, forced them to stop practicing their own religion, and forced them to attend exactly these shitty, boring, British religious rituals for hours and hours and hours. And you're saying everyone loves them. Everyone wants to continue with them. Only a crazy Grinch would be against perpetuating and preserving these cultural traditions forever and ever. Well, one, some people regard those traditions as oppressive. And some people who don't regard them as oppressive regard them as drab and boring. How easy it is. It's too easy to take up the cause of atheism and skepticism merely as an excuse for cheating on your wife. And I'm sorry, but that is part of what's going on right now in 2018.
Oh, do you know, that's a pretty high level, a high standard of grubby behaviour. I lose some respect for you when you say something like that.
I just have to call bullshit on this, Noel. No, this is a real factor. Do you know people? Look, do you just live on the internet? My father was a devout Christian, and he did not grow up in a Christian family. His mother before him, he was raised by a single mother, was not Christian in any way. My father was a devout, profound Christian. He named like his first 4 sons, all really obvious biblical names: Matthew, Christian, Joel, and Adam. Okay, he was completely committed to what he called Christian existentialism. He was sold on, but guess what? He just could not commit to monogamy. For him, really specifically, the idea of having an open relationship, an open marriage, or today people would use words like polyamory. They didn't have terms like that back then, so he probably just called it swinging. He was deeply committed to nudism, and he struggled with being faithful or cheating on his wife, and that broke his faith. Okay? My father was a left-wing extremist. He wasn't just a moderate communist. Compared to other communists, he was an extremist. That didn't break the faith that the Christian religion and the Bible had on him. Okay? Cheating on his wife. The desire to cheat on his wife is what broke it, transformed his whole life. And both gay people and straight people go through this. Where struggling with their own sexuality is what leads them to reject religion. I think you're being an insincere piece of crap by not dealing with this. You just want to act as if I'm not raising something meaningful here when I am. No, I have no statistics to back it up because I think nobody really wants to be honest and come forward and talk about it. The gay community, the trans community, those people will more openly talk about how their sexuality led them to break away from the church. Heterosexual men cheating on their wives, less likely to be honest.
You're not even satisfied with if you're not doing it my way, you're not atheisting right. No, you're going beyond that and just asserting that anybody that doesn't follow your lead has nefarious ulterior motives.
No, that's not true. I think this video would be really too boring if I went through point by point and after every single point he made just said, no, that's not true, you're misrepresenting my argument. He is, step by step, he's misrepresenting my argument at every step, and I think he just sincerely isn't very bright and didn't pay much attention. I don't think he has any ulterior motives at all, and I don't ascribe negative ulterior motives to people who agree with him. I would say that most of the people who agree with him haven't really thought this through short-term or long-term. Short-term, for example, I don't think they've really thought it through, the impacts it will have on their own children if they have and raise children, if they raise those children with Muslim rituals and Muslim festivals, if they raise their children with Hindu customs, Hindu festivals. Now, atheists raising their children in those traditions, as he's endorsing, as he's supporting, you can't imagine any short-term problems with this. Back in the day, back when I was first on the internet, there was a support group for secular Jewish parents who were horrified that their own children had basically converted to Orthodox Judaism. Like, they were Jewish parents who themselves were either atheist or like agnostic and didn't take their religion seriously, but they maintained the customs and rituals of Judaism. And then one day they wake up and they're astonished. Normally their kid as a teenager is in a sense rebelling against them by going back to Judaism, by really taking their religion seriously. If you maintain the outer husk of the religion intact, one of the very clear dangers is simply that the next generation is going to interpret that religion in a manner that is more traditional, that is more forceful, that is more true to what's actually written in the Bible, what's actually written in the Quran, even for religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. So short term, there are real concerns of that kind. And again, I don't know how much real world experience this guy has. If you know some Muslim families, you'll know families like that where they feel like the older generation was this cosmopolitan, secular Muslim family. And then they're shocked that maybe 2 generations on, there are younger people getting radicalized and becoming to some extent fundamentalist and returning to the roots of their religion. Well, why did you raise your kids Muslim? Yeah, you raised them Muslim light. You raised them with a watered down, westernized version of Islam. But guess what? Like, all the components of the bomb were set out on the dining room table, and all it took was your kid to take this seriously, assemble the components, and they've reassembled the same ideology that's been so potent, it's been such a transformative force in the world for centuries. The same elements of the religion that appealed to people powerfully, say 1,000 years ago, they can still appeal to people powerfully today. The long-term problems are even more bizarre. Is your theory that downtown Montreal, Quebec should remain dominated by cathedrals and Christian churches of various kinds forever and ever and ever? Is your theory that 200 years from now in the future, places like Australia and Canada and New Zealand should devote taxpayers' dollars to maintaining and retrenching the infrastructure, the actual architecture, the institutions, the festivals, the recitation of those songs forever and ever and ever? Or, at some point, does it stop? What if you lived in a society where people celebrated the birthday of Adolf Hitler? All over the world, including within Russia and within China, there are people who still celebrate the birthdays of Joseph Stalin, who celebrate Mao Zedong. Those celebrations, those symbolic ritual events, they don't do harm in themselves. They don't hurt people directly. However, they demonstrate who you really are. Regular viewers of this channel will be very familiar with what I'm getting at in that clip, and it's so clearly explained in the video he quoted from there. I mean, obviously he cuts it short, I'm not complaining, but it does not take a lot of intelligence to fill in the conclusion to even what you just heard there in black and white in only so many words, okay? The next step of the argument is to say, look, when someone wears a t-shirt with a swastika, let's just even say a t-shirt that specifically approves of Adolf Hitler, the problem is not that the t-shirt is doing harm. The problem is not that the t-shirt kills people. The t-shirt doesn't travel back in time and kill millions of people. It doesn't directly harm people today. However, a human being wearing that t-shirt, they have revealed to me something about themselves. The t-shirt helps me understand who you are. If you're wearing that t-shirt, that leads me to assume that you are the kind of person who either approves of what Adolf Hitler did in the past, or who even would approve of something similar today, politically, racially, what have you, okay? When I meet people, which happens more often, who are wearing a t-shirt that shows Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong and that is proclaiming that they support communism, okay, the t-shirt doesn't do any harm, but it reveals something to me about you, about your mentality, about your values, about your ethics. It reveals a present tense political problem that is still unfolding. So if I meet someone in Canada who's wearing a t-shirt that says that they support the Anglican Church and the genocide the Anglican Church carried out in Canada, if I met someone who was wearing a t-shirt that specifically approved of the pogroms against Jewish people or forcing Jewish people to live in a ghetto, this is medieval Europe we're talking about here, not the Nazi period, if you ever met someone who's actually wearing the symbols showing that yes, they approve of this tradition, they approve of this history, they approve of this ideology, then that presents a problem in the present tense. And you know what the good news is? Most of the people who are wearing t-shirts that show Mao Zedong, that show a communist leader, they actually are ignorant of what it is they're endorsing. Most of the people who wear a Christian cross are ignorant of what the history of the church is. And if they can be enlightened, if they can learn more about the history of that church, of what those symbols mean, of what was so terribly wrong with that history, then they're probably going to change at least how they're expressing their faith or religion, and they may actually change their attitude towards the political history of Europe in the past, the present, the future, what decisions they want to make to have a secular society as opposed to a theocracy here and now.
So this somewhat staggering false equivalence of celebrating Hitler's birthday with celebrating the modern instantiation of Christmas.
Everything he says from this point forward is complete nonsense that there's no point responding to. This was his initial reaction to me on Twitter, and it's the reaction that carries on and on in this YouTube video, which is just him having a conniption because he's freaked out by the comparison between Christianity and Nazi ideology. But it's not sufficient to understand that I am making such a comparison. You have to understand the allegory and the purpose the allegory is put to. So I do not subscribe to a current left-wing notion of symbolic violence. Okay? I don't subscribe to that. I'm spelling out for you precisely what it is I think the problem is with the symbolic celebration of or respect paid to an ideology like communism, an ideology like the Third Reich in Germany, or an ideology like Christianity, maybe especially in the context of Canada, the United States, and Australia, where the genocide was committed right there by and for this ideology. Now, I don't think it takes a huge amount of intellect to understand the point I'm making. The point is not that Hitler and Jesus are the same. The point is not that Hitler and Santa Claus are the same. Those are outrageously stupid, childishly stupid misinterpretations of both what I said and why I'm saying it. I'm spelling out for you why it is that the employment of these symbols has real political importance here and now, and I'm not subscribing to a stereotypical left-wing approach of claiming symbolic violence or complaining that like speech is violence, or that you're oppressing me by wearing that t-shirt, or that I'm oppressed by the fact that people at Cambridge University are going to attend Christian church services paid for by my tuition. I don't see things that simplistically. But on the other hand, when you're using these clear examples, you have a sense of why it's disturbing, why you detect that there's something wrong when people are wearing t-shirts approving of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Okay? That symbolic significance, that's there for me also when in the 21st century, people are providing even symbolic recognition to God Almighty, Jesus Christ, etc., etc.
Christmas has a very, very different role within our society than celebrations of Hitler's birthday. How would I view somebody who celebrated Hitler's birthday? I'd view them with suspicion, right? Because it's not a normal thing to celebrate. I would assume that if you celebrated Hitler's birthday, that you had sympathies for Hitler. As he says there, it says something about you. Yes, it would in that instance. You really don't have to go out on a limb to celebrate Christmas. It tells me next to nothing about what you believe that you celebrate Christmas.
Do you think that would be true if you were living among the Cree and Ojibwe of Saskatchewan, Indigenous people in Canada? You know what? It actually tells me a lot about you in that cultural context, whether you celebrate Christmas or whether you refuse to because you correctly perceive the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church as responsible for the genocide and overall destruction of your people over decades and decades, but leading up to and including like the 1980s. It's not ancient history for those people. It's not at all. Do you think it tells me something significant about you if you celebrate Christmas in Cambodia, where I used to live and work, by the way? If you celebrate Christmas in Vientiane, the capital city of Laos, all places I've known, all places I've lived and worked, don't you think it tells me something significant about you? Let's just say right now in Laos, if you either refuse all religion, if you embrace the religion of the French Empire that previously conquered Laos and set up, Catholic missionary outfits there and Catholic temples, or if you reject both Buddhism and Catholicism and you subscribe to some kind of Marxist materialist, atheism, yeah, you know what? It tells me a lot about you in all of these contexts. The one exception is you, because you live in such a narrow-minded, white-bread echo chamber that it can't even fucking occur to you that, yes, Noel, it tells me a lot about your lily-white British ass that you don't question Christmas, that you're not willing to question the centrality of this ritual, of this song and dance, of this tradition. You can question other traditions, but not your own. You can't even question that some people, not everybody likes the Anglican Church. Not everybody likes your bullshit cultural values. Just as not everybody likes the opera, and not everybody likes the ballet, not everybody likes Christmas. Not everybody likes sitting in church pews and listening to the Te Deum being recited. But in the political context of the 21st century, now more than ever, you've got to look around and ask, what does atheism mean to you? What does it mean to us? And what is the future we're building? In this case, genuinely, I think that Noel has a valid definition of atheism that's just completely different from mine. The vision of atheism that he spells out at length in the video as a whole, when he's not just insulting me or misinterpreting and misrepresenting what I said, the vision of atheism that he spells out is, in a word, reformed Christianity. That's what he wants. He doesn't want a secular society. He doesn't want one day in the future to walk through the streets of Paris and not see cathedrals. He wants the cathedrals to be there forever and ever. 200 years, 400 years, 500 years. He doesn't want one day in the future to walk through Mecca and Medina and not see people celebrating, throwing stones at Satan and going around in a circle around the Kaaba, touching the magical stone from heaven, this asteroid fragment. No. From his perspective, all of those traditions can continue forever and ever without end. He fundamentally doesn't see a problem with them. He just wants a reformation of religion so that it more suits his 21st century secular sentiments. And that's fine. I actually regard that as a legitimate definition of atheism. It's just one that's completely different from mine. The form of atheism I'm interested in would actually aim at, in future, separation of church and state, something we don't have in Canada, people sure as shit don't have in Saudi Arabia and a lot of countries around the world, but we don't even have it in Canada. I would want a form of secularism, a form of atheism that is actually pursuing a future in which these religious practices cease to exist. And yes, of course, circumcision is way more egregious than the celebration of Christmas. In terms of priorities, of course, getting rid of circumcision, it should be a higher priority. But in terms of the difference you can make in your own life and for the life of your children, getting Christmas out of your life and replacing it with something meaningful and something beautiful, that's something you can do. I focus on the difference I can make in the world. I'm completely powerless to oppose the Catholic Church, even in Cambodia, even in Laos, countries where the Catholic Church is relatively powerless compared to, I don't know, Italy or France. Okay? I'm completely powerless to oppose circumcision, even in the United States of America, a country where the circumcision lobby is less powerful than it is in Saudi Arabia or Indonesia. Okay? Circumcision, male circumcision, huge issue in all these countries. Okay? It would take a huge amount of money, an organization of huge numbers of people, and decades of hard work to even make a dent on the circumcision issue. And that's why it's really worth talking about the difference you can make for yourself and others here and now, within your lifetime, by engaging in positive cultural production, okay? He says some really snarky, backhanded, insulting things like, "Oh, well, I hope your Christmas celebration goes well. You're not the first person." He says, "I'm just like the Jehovah's Witnesses, giving my kid a miserable celebration and refusing to participate in Christmas." No, Noel, I'm not like the Jehovah's Witnesses. You know what I taught my daughter that Christmas? Which, yeah, I had to block people on the internet because I went to France, and then 24/7 for the short period of time I'd custody my daughter. We made Christmas cookies, we did all this stuff. But you know what we did? We replaced Christmas with Sockmas. We told her the story of Socrates, okay? You know what the difference is between Jesus and Socrates? Jesus stood up for what he believed in, was executed for what he believed in. Socrates stood up for what he believed in, was executed for what he believed in. Well, for one thing, Socrates was a real person, not a mythological character. That's a significant difference. But you know what the other difference is? What they believed in. One of the reasons why Socrates was put on trial and executed was that he taught in his school that thunder and lightning are not controlled by Zeus. Thunder and lightning are natural phenomena created and controlled by the clouds. He actively, through discourse and logic and through his teaching, taught people that it was a custom and a superstition to believe that thunder and lightning were controlled by Zeus, that you could pray to Zeus and control those things. That in fact they were natural phenomena controlled by the clouds, that ultimately the clouds were controlled by the vortex of winds in the sky, so on and so forth. Okay? He was willing to stand up for that principle, be put on trial, and die for it. In his own society, he was considered a heretic because he was a secular activist, an atheist activist, after his own fashion, in his own deeply imperfect way. Critique of Socrates would be a separate video to make. Okay? We made Christmas cookies, but the man with a white beard wearing a white toga on those cookies wasn't Santa Claus. It was Socrates. That was a meaningful story I could share with my daughter. We had a wonderful Sockmas, and we had to sit down and explain to her, yeah, you know those buildings we're walking past from the street? Those are churches, but they aren't made for people like us. Our history as ethnic Jews, which is what my daughter is. By blood, she's Jewish the same way I am. She's going to have to deal with anti-Semitism her whole life the same way I did. You know what? Those buildings were made by this religion that persecuted our people. In fact, ultimately, they're the reason why several million of us are now missing and aren't in Europe anymore today, where they aren't here in France, they aren't here in Germany, so on and so forth. Yeah, you know what? That's a terrible, bloody, violent history that excludes and oppresses us. So I'm not going to make cookies celebrating them and their religion. I'm not going to wear a trinket around my neck or a t-shirt that says I'm on their team, because I'm not. I am working for the eventual abolition of Christianity in Canada, the United States, and Europe. And the progress I can make towards that, although tiny, although minuscule, can at least be sincere. I wish more people like you, Noel, would at least share in that sincerity. And maybe together, step by step, we could make a lot more progress.
Da, 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 da.